Continuing on Rule 12, let's talk about misconduct. In this section, we're going to talk about what the rule says regarding caution and disqualification and what the coach's responsibilities are. And then we're going to talk about some interpretations of the same, cautions, disqualifications, and what the coach's responsibilities are. So here's what NFHS Rule 12 says about misconduct. Caution. A player, coach, or bench personnel shall be cautioned, or shown a yellow card, for any of the following: unsporting conduct, and we're going to talk more about this on the next slide, dissent, incidental profane language, persistent infringement, entering or leaving the field of play without the permission of the referee, use of electronic devices to communicate with on-field players, and any use of tobacco products or e-cigarette products. So unsporting conduct is a pretty broad category of misconduct offenses, and it can include any of the following: a reckless foul, a deliberate tactical foul, which oftentimes we refer to this as stopping a promising attack, a deliberate handball to stop an attack, delaying the restart of play, an illegally equipped player, excessive celebration, encroachment, simulating a foul, coaching outside of the team area, deliberate verbal tactics, committing a dog-so foul but where the goal is ultimately scored is considered unsporting conduct, as is committing a dog-so foul inside the penalty area but where the offending player is making an attempt to play the ball and a penalty kick is awarded by the referee. In high school, a cautioned player must leave the field, but they may be replaced. If the team elects to play short, the cautioned player or a substitute may not re-enter the field until the next legal substitution opportunity. Disqualification. A player, coach, or bench personnel shall be disqualified or shown a red card for any of the following: violent conduct, taunting, a second caution issued to the same individual, serious foul play, which includes any direct free kick offense committed with excessive force, and also various dog-so type fouls where the goal is not scored, spitting at another participant, using insulting, offensive, or abusive language or gestures, and leaving the team area to enter the field where a fight or altercation is taking place. A disqualified player must leave the field, may not return to the field, and may not be substituted for. In other words, the player's team is going to have to play with one fewer player. Disqualified players are required to stay in their team area. Disqualified adult team area personnel are required to leave the vicinity of the playing area. High school athletics places a high level of importance on a coach's responsibility for managing and influencing the conduct of his or her players. The head coach is responsible for ensuring that each of his or her players is properly and legally equipped. This is why the head coach receives the first caution for any illegally equipped player on his or her team. Additionally, the head coach may be cautioned or disqualified for any team misconduct that occurs in the bench area that cannot be attributed to any specific individual. Any coach who is disqualified is required to leave the vicinity of the playing area immediately and is prohibited from any contact with the team throughout the remainder of the game. Failure to comply with this rule shall result in the referee terminating the game. Moving on, now let's talk about some interpretations and real-world situations regarding misconduct. If you recall, there are a lot of different infractions that fall under the category of unsporting conduct. So let's go through and talk about a few of those. First is reckless play. This is generally defined as a foul that is committed without consideration for the opponent, or a foul that, while it doesn't necessarily endanger the safety of the opponent, it is one that's delivered with more force than a regular foul. Our next category is a deliberate tactical foul, which is often sometimes known as stopping a promising attack, or SPA for short. Now, there are a few considerations that you need to take into account when you're assessing whether or not you're going to penalize a player for stopping a promising attack. The first is, what is the direction of play? Is the play moving towards the goal, or is it moving towards the touchline or away from the goal? The second consideration is the distance to the goal from where the foul takes place. The closer it is to the goal, the more likely you are to have a promising attack. The third consideration is whether or not the player who was fouled has control of the ball or were likely to gain control of the ball had they not been fouled. And the fourth consideration is the number and location of the attackers and defenders. And really the key considerations there are whether the attacking player that was fouled had space to advance and or whether or not he or she had options. Continuing on with unsporting conduct, our next category here is going to be delaying the restart of play. Typically, this is going to be a situation like where you call a foul and player who committed the foul kicks the ball away so the other team can't get their free kick in quickly. Sometimes this may also be a situation of players taking too long to get a throw in back into play if their team is winning the game and there's not much time left. These things are things that you need to manage early in the game. You don't always want to go directly to a caution. You want to try to issue some warnings, make them very public and loud so that everybody knows it's something you're paying attention to and it's something that you're not going to let players get away with. So if it's a situation where your warnings are not being listened to, then a caution is definitely going to be appropriate. The key here is that if you don't manage these types of situations early in the game and get out in front of it, it's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, to manage it later in the game. And just like with everything else we do, need to make sure you're consistent with how you're managing this from one team to the other. Our next category of unsporting conduct is illegally equipped players. And remember that high school defines illegally equipped as either wearing something that is not allowed or not wearing something that is required. So common examples of this are going to be a player wearing jewelry or a player not wearing shin guards. Remember that in high school, the head coach is issued the first caution for a player who is illegally equipped. Any subsequent players on the same team who have illegal equipment, those individual players would be issued cautions from there on out. Our next type of unsporting conduct is excessive celebration. And this is usually something that will delay the restart of a game or is something that's calling a disproportionate amount of attention to an individual player or players. Most common examples of these things are a player removing their shirt after scoring a goal, or pre-scripted celebrations where the team gets together and has some sort of choreographed thing that they're going to do. We obviously don't want to take the fun away from the game, and we certainly want players to be happy and excited when they score goals, but we do need to remember that sportsmanship is at a premium at the high school soccer level, and so we need to make sure we're enforcing this rule in a way that makes sense. Okay, we have four more types of unsporting conduct to talk about. The first one is encroachment. This is what we typically would refer to as failure to respect distance in the FIFA laws of the game. So, in other words, a player not giving 10 yards to an opponent who is attempting to take a free kick. Now, one note about this, please remember that the players on the opposing team are required to give the 10-yard distance on free kicks. The kicker does not have to ask for it. This is a common misconception, I think, at all levels of play. And so it's something that you can help get ahead of by just addressing it early in the games. And again, making sure that players understand you're not going to let them get away with abusing this rule. The next topic is simulating a foul, and this is typically seen in or close to the penalty area, where you might see a player try to pretend like they were fouled to see if they can trick you into issuing a free kick or a penalty kick. Next up is coaching outside of the team area. Generally, of course, this is going to be something that coaches are going to be doing, but it can certainly include anybody else who's in the bench area. Now, this is one that you want to be careful with and not immediately go to a caution before trying to manage the situation. A lot of our fields that we play on do not have properly marked coaching or team areas. So you're definitely going to want to make sure you're being proactive with giving coaches warnings before you start cautioning coaches for venturing outside of their technical area. And the last topic of unsporting conduct is deliberate verbal tactics. And this is basically just when you have one player verbally trying to distract an opponent while they're playing a ball. Don't see it too often, but we do need to deal with it when it comes up. Okay, now let's talk about some of the other cautionable offenses. First up is dissent. Now remember that dissent can be committed both verbally or physically. So obviously somebody saying something to you, but also waving their arms, throwing the ball, kicking the ball, having some sort of a tantrum. Even if there's nothing verbal, that could also be considered dissent. Now, please exercise common sense when you're dealing with dissent. Dissent is a serious problem in the game, and it is something that we need to deal with. But before you go maybe too quickly to a caution, ask yourself, is this outburst from the player or the coach or whoever it is it directed at you or at your decision, or is it just a brief moment of frustration? So ask yourself that question before deciding whether to take your card out or not. The next cautionable offense is incidental use of vulgar or profane language. So this is one of the distinctions that we have in high school soccer, where if you have some vulgar or profane language, but it is not directed at somebody else, that's going to be a caution, whereas, as we'll see later, language that is directed at or about somebody, that's going to be a red card offense. So this incidental language, examples of that are when a player takes a shot and misses it, and he or she is frustrated with themselves. They, may utter a profanity. Maybe a player making a general comment about how they feel like their team is playing. Those sorts of things are considered incidental language and are cautionable. Now, one note here, if you're going to issue a caution for this, you need to make sure that you can identify the offending player. Don't guess and don't take another player's word for it. If you can't identify who it is, then you're probably better off just issuing a big public warning for everybody, and hopefully that'll take care of it moving forward. The next cautionable offense is persistent infringement. And remember that persistent infringement can be really one of two things. It's either one particular player who continually is committing fouls, but it could also be a pattern of fouls by multiple players against a specific player. So in other words, one particular player on a team is just continuing to get fouled by the other team, even though it may be a number of different players committing those fouls. Both of those two scenarios are considered persistent infringement. And now we have our final two cautionable offenses. First up is entering or leaving the field of play without the permission of the referee. Now, obviously, this doesn't include a player leaving the field of play through the normal course of play, just running, trying to chase a ball. Usually, this is something that happens relating to substitution. A player who's waiting for a substitution comes on the field before the referee beckons them on. That's usually where we see this type of infraction take place. And the final one, we don't see this too often, but remember that coaches and bench personnel are not allowed to use electronic communication devices to communicate with field players who are actively playing the game. Okay, moving on now to disqualifications or red card offenses. Our first one up is exhibiting violent conduct. Now, main consideration that you need to have clarity on regarding violent conduct is that violent conduct is something that's committed while not trying to play or challenge for the ball. So this can include, striking, punching, kicking an opponent, also a teammate, a referee, a coach, any other participant in the game. But these are things that are taking place away from the ball. That's the distinction between violent conduct and serious foul play, which is something that we'll talk about on the next slide. The next red card offense is taunting. Keep in mind that taunting can be either verbal or physical. Some examples of taunting that you see listed here are standing over an opponent and yelling at them after a foul, running over to an opponent's bench and celebrating after you've just scored a goal against them, or making demeaning, ridiculing, or embarrassing comments about another participant. All these things have no place in the game, especially at the high school level. So there's no warning involved for these things. You have a taunting situation, the player needs to be disqualified with a red card. The next red card offense is kind of self-explanatory, subsequent caution. So if the same player receives a second caution in the game, that's going to result in a disqualification. Now, one note about this is the second caution they receive does not need to be a quote-unquote worse foul than the first one. Or in other words, it's not your job as a referee to help keep a player in the game just because they may already be sitting on a caution. It's the player's responsibility to adjust their play and to adjust their behavior accordingly. So if they do have a caution, they're hopefully going to be playing in such a way that's going to help them keep themselves on the field rather than you trying to do it for them. Moving on to serious foul play, we have two main types of serious foul play in high school soccer. The first is any direct free kick foul while playing for the ball where a disproportionate or unnecessary or excessive amount of force is used. This can also include play where the player committing the foul is clearly not considering the safety or well-being of the opponent when committing the foul. But the key consideration is that for it to be serious foul play, it must be a player who is making an attempt to play for the ball as opposed to it being something off the ball or away from the ball. The next type of serious foul play is our denying an obvious goal scoring opportunity or dog-so situation. And there are four main considerations that you need to think about when determining whether an offense is a dog-so offense or not. The first is the number of defenders. Typically with a dog-so, the player committing the offense is either going to be the last defender or the second to last defender. The next consideration is the general direction of the play. In other words, is the play moving towards the goal or is it moving towards the touchline or away from the goal? The third consideration is the likelihood that the attacker is going to keep the ball or gain control of the ball were they not fouled. And then the last consideration is the distance between the goal and where the offense occurred. So naturally, the closer you are into the goal, the more likely you could consider this to be an obvious goal scoring opportunity. Really what you need to ask yourself in these situations is, if the offending player had not committed the foul, would the attacking player have had an obvious opportunity to score a goal or not? And if the answer to that question is yes, then you have a dog-so and you have a red card situation, except for some of the exceptions we talked about in the previous section, where there are some situations with a dog-so where if a goal is scored, in some cases, you scale that back to a caution instead of a send-off. And again, those were discussed previously in the caution section of this module. Next up for red card offenses is spitting at another participant. Just take note that it does not necessarily have to be spitting at an opponent. It could also be a teammate or a referee. Each of those are going to be considered a red card offense. Here again, make sure you know who the offending player is and that you've seen it happen. Don't guess on this and don't take a player's word for it. Next up is using insulting, offensive, or abusive language or gestures. So here is a situation where we've got this type of language being directed at or about another participant. And again, participant can be a player, a referee, a bench personnel, coach. Just like we talked about above, you're probably seeing a pattern here. Make sure you've heard it. Make sure you know who the person is that committed the offense before you issue a red card disqualification to somebody. Do not guess at who it is and do not take another player's word for it. Next up for red card offenses are leaving the team area to enter the field where a fight or an altercation is taking place. So the first thing you'll note here is that it says, unless summoned by an official. So one thing to consider is that if you do have a fight or an altercation happening on the field and you can see that one or both of the team's coaches are wanting to come onto the field and it's obvious to you that the purpose of them coming onto the field is to help break up the fight or to help calm the situation down. This is a situation where you should absolutely allow the other adults, the coaches, to come and be a helpful force in the situation. So make sure that you're not red carding somebody who you want to have on the field helping you out. Situations like this, especially if you have a lot of people involved, it can sometimes be very difficult to identify who the person or people are that are coming onto the field that need to be disqualified. Do the best you can. Talk about it in your pregame with your partners on your crew on who is going to handle what part of a mass confrontation, who is going to be watching for what, and just do the best you can with recording numbers of players so that we make sure that we are properly enforcing this rule to the best of our ability. So at the high school level, just remember that coaches do bear an extra level of responsibility as it relates to misconduct. There are two main areas where this is the case. We've already talked about these, but just to recap, one is with respect to the player's equipment. The coach is responsible for making sure that the players are properly and legally equipped. And again, as one more reminder, that is why the first caution for an illegally equipped player on each team would go to the head coach before subsequent cautions would go to individual players. The second area where coaches are expected to have an extra level of responsibility are in relation to the players and the bench personnel in the bench area. One thing to note that is specific to high school rules is that if you are unable to identify an individual that has committed a cautionable or a disqualifying offense in the bench area, then the NFHS rules empower you to issue the corresponding sanction to the team's head coach, because again, they're the ones who bear the responsibility for fostering a positive sportsmanship environment among their team. So in conclusion, just remember that in the world of high school athletics, the field is intended to be an extension of the classroom. So not just a competitive activity, but a learning environment as well. And this is why we see some of the rules written the way that they are, particularly as they relate to misconduct and sportsmanship. Keep in mind that there are some types of misconduct that simply have no gray area. Things like illegal equipment, vulgar or profane language, taunting. These are good examples where there's no wiggle room for warnings, and there are no shades of these types of offenses. These are offenses that have no place in the game and will carry very specific penalties along with them. Other types of misconduct require some interpretation of the referee. Misconduct, yellow cards, red cards, are just another tool that you have to help you manage the game, but they're certainly not your only option. As always, preventative refereeing and good player management are always going to be major important keys to refereeing a successful game.